So tonight, without too much further ado here, I want to introduce Dwayne Hartman. He's a 22-year veteran in safety, 19 years with Lockton.
Thank you. As Eric said, my name is Dwayne Hartman. I'm a senior loss control consultant with Lockton Companies. We help our clients with safety and health compliance, job site inspections, accident investigation, training, etc. When it comes to construction safety, we help our clients with all aspects of that. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on what is Silica. I do want to point out some things that kind of triggered this response from OSHA. But in the biggest picture, we have to look at silica as the second most common mineral in the Earth's crust. So silica is everywhere. There's a misconception out there that all silica is hazardous, and that's not at all the case. OSHA is targeting, for good reason, what we call crystalline silica, and there are several different types of it. You see here quartz, cristobalite, tridymite, and tripoli. Those are the four most common types of crystalline silica that can be hazardous if they are at the right particle size in the right settings. If we are talking about amorphous silica, there is literally zero concern with it. Okay, so as later on you'll see a slide up here I talk about we should look at an SDS sheet to see if A, it has silica in it, and B, what type. So if it's amorphous silica, we're good to go. It's not at all hazardous. It's crystalline silica that is the primary concern of the two different types. As you could imagine, the construction industry is more impacted by this rule than any industry out there. As Eric alluded to, in June of last year, this new law went into effect, which meant it was federal law as of June of last year. Normally an enforcement date is 3 to 4 months. They recognize the impact. They made the enforcement date 1 year from the effective date. So the original enforcement date was June 23rd of this year for the construction industry. General industry and maritime industry still have another year. They have since pushed that back, as Eric alluded to. It's now September 23rd is the enforcement date, which means from that date going forward you can receive an OSHA citation for any violations occurring with the standard. But obviously, when you have this many different activities on a job site whereby it's impacted or a potential silica exposure, it's going to have a big impact in the overall industry. I think that's why we're all here listening diligently, because we know it can be a big deal. I told Eric when he asked me to come and speak, I said, I'm not sure you could have picked a better topic, because in my 22-year career, I think this is the most impactful OSHA standard without question, unequivocally, for the construction industry. So especially those of you who are affected by it. Another word I want to clear up, make sure that we're comfortable in what we're talking about, is a word that's rarely used. It's called respirable. This means that we are talking about very small particle size crystalline silica. Our bodies have an internal filter system. It's our nose, the back of our throat, etc., that traps a lot of particles when there's dust in the air. If the particles are of respirable size, that means our built-in filter system can't trap them. It goes through our nose, through the back of our throat, into our lungs, and guess what? It stays there. Never comes out. Okay, so that's the problem. The more silica you breathe, it stays with you over long periods of time. It can become a disabling or even fatal injury. When we talk about small, I mean very small. We're talking like 100 times smaller than a grain of sand. But the only way for someone to know truly whether or not something is respirable is with a sampling device. So no one can look at silica or a cloud of dust and say it's respirable. It has to be measured by a qualified person with instrumentation that has filters. I'll show you some pictures of that later. It's called a cyclone filter. But it's those measurements that will dictate whether or not it's actually respirable. Okay, just to clear up some of the terminology, it is some dangerous stuff. I'm not at all criticizing OSHA for the standard. It's a known occupational disease and illness that's been in the industry for decades. It was long overdue. It's debatable whether or not they crossed the line in the requirements of the standard, making it, like I said, the most impactful. But at the end of the day, it's a known illness and respiratory hazard in the construction industry that should have been addressed regulatory and regulations long ago. lung cancer, COPD, kidney disease, silicosis is probably the most common one that we hear about. This is a disabling, non-reversible, and sometimes fatal lung disease. The good news is, though, it's 100% preventable. So when we have tool manufacturers like Hilti and DeWalt and all these companies that are on board trying to develop better products to capture the dust, when we have wet saws, when we have companies that understand it, we now have a government that's got a regulation on it, we can dramatically reduce the amount of silicosis cases in the United States. There are really three different types of silicosis. There's chronic, which means low-level exposure for a very long time. Then there's the middle category we call accelerated. That means high-level exposure for a smaller period of time, usually about 5 to 10 years of repeated overexposure. And then there's acute, which is very rare, but this is extremely high levels and can even be fatal in as short as only a few weeks or months if someone actually breathes in that much respirable crystalline silica. Their lungs actually drown in their own fluid. They can't extract the oxygen from the air that we breathe in. So it's obviously a serious issue. Most of the time silicosis is not fatal, but there are symptoms that you would be surprised to learn. I mean, night sweats, weight loss, loss of appetite, fatigue, weakness, severe cough, over and over. There's a lot there. Okay, so it's a nasty illness, it really is. I'm going to get into the actual requirements of the standard at this point, and I want to preface this with a few notes. This is a brand new regulation, even though it's been in effect for a year, which means that OSHA, as of today, has not yet issued what we call a letter of interpretation. When there's a new standard, any new standard, it always generates a lot of questions from the general public. They send a letter into OSHA formally and they say, hey, here's my scenario, am I in violation or am I not? Or could you further clarify this or that? They've not yet issued one of those responses yet on the Silica rule, and that's not out of the ordinary. They are very hesitant and careful to issue one of those because when they do issue it, it carries the equivalent weight of the law. Okay, so when you're trying to answer a question or you ask some safety professional like me and we begin researching your question, we search letters of interpretation just like we do the actual OSHA standards too. So in time, we're going to get some more clarification. I do know a lot about what is the construction industry in general and what's contained in this rule, but there's also some very good questions out there that have yet to be answered. I'll do my best to point those out as we go through. There's another rumor out there too that the Trump administration, you know, with the stroke of a pen can get rid of this. There's nothing further from the truth. That's called the Congressional Review Act process. And the CRA process, depending on the law, is either 30 or 60-day window time frame from the date it went into effect. Okay? Prior to the Trump administration, that had only been done one time. When George W. Bush came into office, the Clinton administration had finished working on and ran through an ergonomics rule with the stroke of a pen. He got rid of it. Well, because this went into effect in June of last year, he simply can't do that. He can't get rid of the law. Once a labor secretary is approved, who then appoints an assistant secretary of labor, who's the head of OSHA, then that person can make some determinations on how they're going to enforce this rule, but it's simply not going to go away. They may, in fact, kick the enforcement can down the street again, but for the most part, it's here to stay. So we need to get on board with it, is the best advice I can give you. There's also OSHA's multi-employer doctrine. This is a whole separate topic, but it's really the relationship of general contractors and subs and owners and who's responsible for what. Years ago, OSHA used to see a problem on site and they would say, well, whose extension cord is this? And everyone would do that, right? So now, based upon the role you're playing on the job site, you will possibly have a little different duties when it comes to silica as opposed to a general contractor, okay, who's simply providing oversight on making sure the subs are doing what they're supposed to be doing because they too can be held accountable for subcontractor non-compliance. Those are the dates I was talking about. 9/23 of this year is really the day that you need to have your ducks in a row and a good compliance plan in place. I don't want to get too technical here, but there are a couple exposure levels that we need to be aware of. Really, there are two. One is called the action level. And with those sampling devices I was talking about earlier, if a hygienist comes out and takes samples, that means at 25 micrograms per cubic meter, that's what we call the action level. That means the standard applies to you or your task and all these rules. But at 50 micrograms per cubic meter, that's the permissible exposure limit, and above that means you are in violation of the law. So there are other things you have to do in order to get that number down. At the end of the day, OSHA wrote this in a manner to try to simply reduce the amount of respirable crystalline silica in the industry. And the controls they put in place, or the regulations, if followed, will in fact do that. Okay? There's this Y in the road, the compliance path, to what I call it, the fork in the road. And eventually, an employer is going to have an opportunity to follow the instructions on table 1, or they're going to be able to say, you know, appreciate the help, OSHA, but we're going to take the bull by the horns. We're going to do our own sampling. We're going to figure out what controls best to put in place to protect our people. And ultimately, that's going to be the employer's decision, and I can't tell you which one is better. It's going to be based upon your scenario and exposures. But prior to this, here's where I'm going to spend most of the time. Before we get to this fork in the road, we have basically 6 things that every contractor who is affected by the silica rule has to do. Okay, this is before you make the decision in the fork of the road. Number 1, we have to establish and implement a written exposure control plan. I'm going to talk about each of these in a few minutes. A competent person is a phrase many of us have probably already heard of, right? OSHA, it's a term that OSHA uses for fall hazards and scaffolding and excavation and all this other stuff. And there's some housekeeping practices. And then there's the big one. Okay, when we get to number 4, this is where is really causing some people some heartburn, is the medical evaluation, or what they call medical surveillance. Then there's the training that goes along with it. There's nothing new with that. I mean, every OSHA standard, not everyone, a lot of them have training requirements. And then there's a lot of records that you need to be aware of that are going to be generated from this rule that you need to maintain. Actually, for 30 years, that's an existing OSHA standard as well. Let's start off with talking about the exposure control plan. This is not a written section in your corporate safety manual. It can be, and I've produced one of those for our clients to give them as a sample. This is basically a one-page document, and this is the one illustrated here as OSHA sample, that basically says, we're going to be cutting concrete with this type of saw. Okay, and on this, it can be as simple as a one-page document. We're going to talk about the tasks in the workplace that can produce respirable hazards, respirable crystalline silica. We're going to talk about the controls, the housekeeping measures, what we're doing to restrict access, who the competent person is. All of that information can be contained on this one document. So at the end of the day, if you're doing 3 or 4 different tasks that generate silica, you should have 3 or 4 different task-specific exposure control plans. Okay, late in this presentation, one of my last slides on here gives you a website that you can go to for free, plug in your data, put down some drop-down menus, and get those for free. Good sample programs, right? So safety professionals like myself, others in the industry, you'll start seeing more samples of these, but they need to be specific to your task and your company's operations. If you have a section that you also capture this information in and put into your corporate safety program, I think that's great. The more user-friendly a safety program can be, I think the better tool it is to control loss. But at the end of the day, you don't have to have that section. You do have to have a written exposure control plan. The second one is like I said a minute ago, a lot of us are already familiar with that term, competent person. They only made one slight adjustment. That's the red text you see up there in the actual definition. The competent person must have the knowledge and ability necessary to implement the written exposure control plan required under the standard. So that means that our competent person has to be able to recognize the hazards. They have to be competent in knowing what silica is, how to control those hazards, and what your specific company's compliance plan is. They are the go-to person on the crew. They make the decisions, they assess the hazard, they monitor the controls to make sure they're working correctly, and then they're the ones that has to know what the exposure control plan consists of, and they put that plan into motion on the job site. I would consider the competent person to be the absolute critical link to making sure your company's in compliance, you know what the rules are, and that they're actually putting a plan in place in the field that's effective, that's controlling the the exposures. They do initial evaluations, they monitor it. If there's anything that comes up, you know, if we're using a wet saw process and the person who's using the saw is creating an enormous cloud, what does that tell you? Something's broken, right? The process isn't working, the plan is not working, and it's the competent person that needs to act on that and make sure that the controls are changed and put into place. Usually in the construction industry, who do we see as the competent person? The foreman, the superintendent, someone that's already in a leadership position. It doesn't have to be. If you have a one-person crew out there working by themselves, which I would discourage, generally speaking, that one person can also serve as the competent person. Okay? They just have to have the authority to take prompt corrective measures. They have to be trained to recognize the hazards and then act on those. It's very common in the industry. Now we also have what's called a qualified person. This is not really much of a different definition at all in OSHA standard. It's in other standards. This is kind of a step up from competent. This is a qualified person who by extensive training, knowledge, degree, certifications, etc., relating to the subject matter. So for purposes of Silica and OSHA Silica standard, who do you think the qualified person would be? Is this a foreman or someone like that? Probably not. This is going to be that industrial hygienist or safety professional who's familiar with the instrumentation for hygiene testing that comes out, that does the sampling, that consults with you, that reads and interprets the data and gives you a report back saying you're above the action level but you're below the Pell, or you're not exposed at all, or whatever. That's usually going to be the qualified person when we're talking about Silica. The number 3 category tonight we're going to talk about is restricting of housekeeping practices. I wanted to point this out. This is pretty vague right now. OSHA is clear to say that no dry sweeping is allowed, but then on the next page of a document that's also in your handout, their publication 3902, I believe it is, or 3092, they talk about how we are not talking about general sweeping, right? We're not talking about sweeping soil up from the slab to clean the floor. We're talking about those processes that use the high energy, high impact tools, chipping, sawing, grilling, grinding on concrete or stone or other products that have crystalline silica in them. If that becomes airborne and to a respirable size, it's my interpretation at this point, that's what they're talking about, that they don't want us to use a broom to dry sweep and sweep up that fallout. I would question whether or not we're doing our job to begin with if we have that cloud of dust. Later on you'll hear me talking about Table 1, which if we're following Table 1, we should never have a cloud of dust. But this is a little gray. I'm not quite sure where they're going to go with this, but for general purposes, this was taken directly from their document. Employers are not required to follow these requirements when cleaning ordinary soil, large debris, non-silica containing materials such as sawdust, etc. I think they're focused on respirable crystalline silica. If we have generated that in large quantities, we shouldn't be dry sweeping it to clean it up. So another slide later on, I'm probably going to skip over, but it talks about HEPA filtered vacuums. That's what they're talking about. I think it's probably a good idea we buy some stock in HEPA filtered companies, right? Hilti out there, whatever it may be. These are going to become a lot more popular than they have been today. Okay, you may have been sitting there so far thinking, well, Dwayne, you brought the doom and gloom, and this really isn't that bad. All right, let me cover this category, and then maybe you need to revisit it. This is what is giving most contractors the biggest amount of heartburn over the rule, and is what is really causing them the grief. Because what I'm about to tell you here with the medical evaluations, what they call medical surveillance, is not always practical. It's not always efficient. It's certainly not cheap, etc. Okay, so when we talk about this, you need to remember the trigger point of 30 days of wearing a respirator in a year. If you have employees that wear respirators today, and you know they have to because of Silica or some other regulation, this is the trigger point. If they're wearing respiratory protection for 30 days because of a Silica exposure, then the medical surveillance program applies to them. Okay? That's the trigger. If they wear it 29 days in a year, we do a little job here and there occasionally, then this doesn't apply to them. This is only for people who will wear a respirator for 30 or more days in a year. There's this cool phrase they put out, physician or other licensed healthcare professional for the purposes of this training, and you'll hear me refer to them as the doctor. That just makes it easy for our communication. It doesn't mean they have to be an MD. There is a clear definition, and it's right there on who the PLHCP is, but I'm going to refer to them as the doctor. Here's one of the things I pointed out because of who my audience is this evening. The employer is required to cover the cost of travel, and this is when an employee is going to a clinic or medical facility as part of the medical surveillance program. The employer must also pay employees for time spent traveling and taking the medical examinations. Now, that may not seem too bad, right? We send people in for drug testing. We send people in maybe for audiograms or for whatever else, for whatever other reason, functional capacity evaluations. It can be a little tricky though. Here's the frequency of the medical surveillance program. Initially, right when we assign that person into a job where we know they're going to have to wear a respirator for 30 or more days in a year, or when they hit that trigger, the first one they go to is called the initial baseline medical evaluation. Here's a listing of all the things that it includes. A medical work history, which OSHA recognizes that your employee, especially if they're new, that information is not going to be readily available to you, probably. So it's a matter of knowing what we know about the person's background. But there's other things. There's the chest x-ray, there's a pulmonary function test, a latent tuberculosis test, and some other tests, any other test, in fact, as deemed necessary by the doctor at the time. Okay? Within 30 days of their initial assignment, that first baseline test, medical evaluation, is supposed to be completed. And then, every 3 years thereafter, okay, it'll be the exact same as the baseline, except they drop off the latent tuberculosis test. I'll talk more about that in a second. Now, at any time, during any of these medical evaluations, if the doctor determines that a specialist needs to be seen, then that too is on you, the employer, and that has to happen within 30 days after receiving the doctor's recommendations for that specialist. Okay? I want to make sure that we're clear on this. This is not a workers' compensation claim at this point. This is an OSHA standard that says you, the employer, has to provide these medical evaluations. So this is the clinic sending you a bill, and you pay those costs. Yes?
So you said if they are required to wear a respirator for more than 30 days in a year, with some of the new dustless technology, is it still required to wear a respirator when we're using?
We're going to get there, and that's a good question. His question was, because of the dustless technology, or the equipment or tools that produce much less dust, is it still a requirement to wear a respirator? That's going to depend on the answer you take when you get to the fork in the road. But that's a good question, yes.
What is the standard for 1 day of having a respirator?
If a person puts on a respirator because of a silica hazard, that counts as 1 day. If they wear it a second or 10 minutes or 8 hours, that's 1 day. Another good question. Okay? These are your costs. This is not an insurance company that's going to be cutting this check. Now, in some further investigation and work that I've done, I was planning to do this anyway. When I learned I was going to be speaking to a group of estimators, I expedited my investigation here, but I talked to several different clinics. The first one I spoke to was up in Omaha, Nebraska, Comp Choice, and they sent me the information that I have listed here on the screen. There's a couple things I wanted to bring to your attention. One is the price. This is for an initial baseline medical evaluation. This particular clinic is charging $363.50, which really is actually kind of cheap. Of the 3 or 4 clinics I spoke to, this is the cheapest one I found. But maybe more importantly was not the price of $363. In their quote and their protocol, it actually takes 3 visits to the clinic in order to complete the first initial baseline medical screening. Okay, so we all know what that means. That's 3 trips, you're paying for them. It's pulling them off the job site 3 times. Part of this is the latent tuberculosis test I talked about. I'm no medical professional, but it's my understanding they They poke you with a needle, and then you have to come back, as listed here, in 48 to 72 hours for them to make a reading of the TB results, meaning if there's a bump, then you're positive. If there's not a bump, you're negative, something to that effect, which is one of the reasons they have to come back 2 days later. The third one is what's called a B read of the chest x-ray. So my guess is, and again, I'm no medical professional, but I think the more rural clinics that you get to, if they are familiar with this, they're going to have to send that off. This was Omaha, Nebraska, and they had to send that to Kansas City to be read and then back. So the good news is, some other local chains of clinics I spoke to here in Kansas City, it was a lot better news there. The price did go up. Concentra, for example, I was really impressed with them. I want to give them a plug. Their website has an entire white paper article about the medical aspect and all of the medical surveillance stuff associated with the new rule. So that tells me they're clearly on board. They know what's going on with it. Their price range was higher. I call that $400 plus because some employees are also putting in a respirator fit testing, which adds to that cost, but it's a great idea to consolidate those two. If you know they're going to have to wear a respirator, obviously that's what triggered the visit. If they have to get fit tested anyway, so just have the same clinic do it, the same visit. Concentra's website's there. There's a link to the article. I read the article. It's good. I give them props because they're out ahead of this. I told the first clinic I spoke to, which was actually in Des Moines, Iowa, I said, are you folks familiar with the new Silica rule and what's going to be required of the medical surveillance program? And they said, like, silicone? What? What? So right away it told me there are clinic chains out there who are ahead of the game, and then there are others who are not. Another one here in Kansas City is US HealthWorks. I didn't get exact pricing from them, but I can say that they are able to, and I didn't say this, also with Concentra and US HealthWorks here in town, they can do the initial baseline in one total visit. So that's a plus. I'm not sure how, I guess they're giving the employee instructions, you know, with the TB test, if there's a bump raised, call us back, or whatever the case may be. I'm not sure how they're doing that, but they did tell one of my largest clients here in town that they can do it in one visit. So those two are here. I think what the best thing to do would be, and the best advice I could give you, is instead of me trying to break down clinics that you may or may not use, I think you need to call up your clinic or chain of clinics, their headquarters, and ask them a few good questions. Okay, are you familiar with the new OSHA Silica rule? I think by this point most of them are probably going to say yes. What is the cost to complete the initial baseline, and how many subsequent visits do my employees have to go to? How many total visits, and then does the clinic also offer respirator fit testing? Those are just a few questions that I thought of quickly when I put that down. But you need to be talking to them, and then maybe shop around. I think this is a significant enough rule. You know, I have a client that does concrete cutting. That's what they do all over the country. That's the only thing they do. So this is, as you can imagine, the impact they have. They have literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of employees that are affected by this. So I think it's probably worth your wait and time to go in, do some research, find a clinic that you're comfortable with that can bring value to the process. Maybe you beat them up a little bit about the price. The volume brings the price down, of course. So that's my best advice I can give you on the clinic. There is also three other things here that I wanted to just quickly touch on and kind of fly through, but it's not just the medical evaluation. There is a tremendous amount of administrative work that has to be done. There are three different lines of communication, I will call it. There's information that has to be sent from the employer to the doctor, and all this is spelled out in the slides you've been given as a handout, as well as in the standard. There's information that the doctor reports to the employee, also within 30 days. And then thirdly, there is information that comes from a report from the doctor to the employer. And based upon the results of this medical screening, if there are, I will call medical concerns that are raised or other problems found that are clearly not work-related, the employee has to sign another form that the doctor can provide that information to the employer. If it's about a chest x-ray, if it's something work-related, if they're sent there, obviously it's not a HIPAA violation. You have access to that information because you have to, the doctor's going to say, yes, they can wear a respirator, or no, they cannot. Or they're going to give some sort of restrictions. and then it's up to you to decide whether or not they're in that position, in the right job, or whatever. But there's a lot of triangular information that has to take place between the employee, the employer, and the doctor. The good news is, right in the OSHA standard, they give us 3 different PDF forms that you can download. And I would encourage you to download those forms. Don't tweak them, don't alter them, use them as they are. If it's ever questioned on whether or not you're following the right rules, they're OSHA's forms. So that's probably the best defense you could have. But it's not real complicated. There's a lot of administrative work, but if you read through the requirements in the process, you'll see the information that has to take place. All of which is usually within 30 days. So that's going to be a question mark too. I don't know how we tell doctors to speed up their process, but I guess if we send them enough work, we can have some leverage on that. Okay, is there any questions on medical surveillance? That's one of the things that is really causing people a lot of concern. It's not necessarily new to construction safety if you think about it. We've done pulmonary function tests for years. We have asbestos exposure and lead and these other things that require medical intervention. I would say the biggest difference with this is the level of intervention and the timelines. You know, this is not a go get cleared to wear a respirator or fill out the form and we send it into a doctor so you can wear a respirator. This is involved and it's every 3 years. And it may trigger other things. You know, if that specialist is needed, then the question becomes, is it a workers' compensation claim? I'm not a claims specialist. I'm not going to purport to be, but I've heard our claims people say that that's all jurisdictional. Every state is different. Missouri is different from Kansas versus the other states, right? So that's going to determine at some point when the employee comes to you and says, I think this is work-related and I want to see a doctor for this item that was found during my medical surveillance. And that's where I'm going to leave it because every scenario is different and I'm not a claims expert, but I do anticipate there being workers' compensation claims as a result of the medical surveillance requirements that OSHA's put out. Okay, number 5, training workers. This is not different. I would envision this really as 2 different levels of training. You're going to have, and I say it's not different because there are a lot of OSHA standards. There's a book this thick they published that lists all of the training requirements. But you will start to see OSHA 10 and 30-hour outreach instructors, I would guess for the health portions that they have to cover in this. You'll probably start seeing this topic in OSHA 10-hour classes. I'm going to incorporate it into our 10-hour training at Lockton's office. But really we're talking about 2 different levels of training. That, if it's incorporated in a 10-hour training, I think that would suffice as awareness level training is normally what we call it. This is the end user. This is the person with that's running the saw. This is the person wearing the respirator. They need to know about respirable hazards. They need to know about silica. They need to know what an exposure control plan is, who their competent person is. A basic awareness level training that does need to be site or company specific. The other type of training I envision you doing is what we call competent person training. And there are some great consultants out there, and I don't want to diminish the value and resources that can come to your company by a third-party safety consultant, but I do want to caution you about this. Just because someone puts in an ad, competent person training, doesn't really make it competent. It's not that third-party safety consultant that is tapping your employees and saying, you folks are the 4 competent persons and here's why. They're going to give you very good information like we're talking about tonight. They're going to do you a world of service to educate you and your people on what OSHA requires and what the silica hazards are. But I stress this because it's your job as the employer to denote who the competent person is. Okay, and why is that sometimes tough to get when you send them to a class, you know, that's open to the public? Is because they don't know what type of saws you're using. They don't know what your specific SOP it may or may not be in your company. They don't know the results that you have from the hygienist you hired 3 years ago. So a lot of it needs to be company specific. Now you can send them to those competent person classes, and then once you formalize your compliance plan, you bring them in, you know, and then you talk about your specific company instead of just OSHA this or OSHA that. Okay, that's what OSHA wants. That's called a company-specific training. It's job site specific. It's hazard and controls specific. Sometimes third-party consultants are quick to give you a certificate that says competent person, when really it's kind of an unfinished training process. I just wanted to throw that out there. And I, again, don't mean to diminish the resources what third-party safety people can bring to your operation, or even your in-house people. Okay, so that's the 2 types of training. Lastly, for the 6, what they call is, it's really a records retention policy. If you are heavily involved and affected by this standard, you're going to have a lot of records that are generated. You're going to have possibly air monitoring data. If you hire that certified hygienist to come out, they do sampling, they're going to give you a report and an analysis of the data and their interpretation, and whether you're above the PEL, below the action level, etc. That's data that you're going to have. By law, you have to keep that. The second type is objective data. And I think it's great that OSHA put this into the standard. Objective data is that same sampling data, except maybe it wasn't you that paid and brought out the hygienist, okay? So let's take, for example, my client who cuts concrete. They are a member of the Concrete Sawyers and Drillers Association of America. And as an added value service to those members, the CSDA goes out and they hire a hygienist. And they stage all these scenarios. A walk behind saw outdoors, a walk behind saw indoors, a handheld cutoff saw indoors and outdoors, drilling concrete indoors and outdoors. And they pay this hygienist to take all these samples, right? And that is what OSHA calls objective data, which means you can use that, but I would caution you, it needs to be very similar circumstances to what your task is. So if you're one of those companies that you drill concrete, it's clearly applicable, the standard is in play, but you occasionally drill concrete, it's always in an industrial setting or indoors. It's easier for you to use that than maybe it was 20-mile-an-hour wind the day the samples were taken by the CSDA, but on your job site it's a 4-mile-an-hour wind. So OSHA can shoot darts at your logic or attempted use of objective data if it's not very similar circumstances. Does that make sense to everyone? So what we hope to have in time is the AGC has talked about this anyway. Hilti, a manufacturer, is talking about this. Eventually, over time, we hope to have large national databases of this type of testing data, where you can go there for free, you can drop down, we're outdoors, the wind is 10 miles an hour, we're drilling concrete, you put in your variables, and then the objective data, if available in the database, comes out and you can see. Are we exposed? Is it a serious concern? Is it a high exposure, or are we not? That's a long ways off. I hope we get there. Someone has to take those reins and control that entire process, but hopefully we get there. And in time, with the free online stuff, some of which is at the back of my presentation, you'll already see and have access to. Like I said, the free exposure control plans you can generate. Hopefully that gets easier. Okay, that's objective data. I'm glad OSHA put that option in there, but be careful in using it. When you hire a consultant to come out and do sampling on your people, and that task, that type of saw, that process, those variables don't change, that's great data. There's going to be no better than that, okay? Medical surveillance, of course, all these doctor visits, pulmonary function tests, all the forms that I told you OSHA gives you and you use those, all of that needs to be kept. There's a separate OSHA standard that says records retention need to be kept in place for 30 years in some instances, so especially anything medically related. And that's 30 years from the date of their last employment with you. Okay, so that's a long time. What does that mean? We keep all records, right, indefinitely. Okay? So, there are the 6. I didn't see anyone pass out, right? It's tough, it's cumbersome, it's new, there's a lot to it, but we're still here, okay? We're doing good. Now we're at the fork in the road. Table 1 is an option that OSHA gave a lot of thought to. They put a lot of research, time, effort into it, and they came up with this table, which is also one of your handouts, that lists 18 different pieces of equipment or tasks. Okay? 18 of those. In every one of those, there will be, here's the equipment task. For example, handheld power saw, any blade diameter. Okay? The middle column says engineering and work practice control methods. Those are things that you have to do. Okay? If you elect to follow Table 1, that means you have to follow Table 1 fully. We can't piecemeal it and decide to do this or that. We have to follow Table 1 fully if this is the route we're taking in the fork in the road. Okay, the middle is engineering work practices. It's very common. You'll see this repeated throughout Table 1. You saw equipped with integrated water delivery system that continuously feeds water to the blade. And if you read into that a little further, it'll need to be at a rate that the manufacturer recommends, right? Another common one, operate and maintain the tool in accordance with manufacturer's instructions to minimize dust emissions. Hilti, DeWalt, Target, they're all coming up with standard processes that may be standard for their company or industry-wide, but they're going to give you more detailed instructions what to do, what not to do in the future than what they have in the past. I will give a lot of them credit. There have been tools on the market and available for purchase that had dust collecting systems, 10 years ago, right? But it was always optional, and people may or may not have wanted to pay for it. If you're in the process right now of changing out your tools and you have that option, I would strongly encourage you to buy the dust collection system options or the port that's got the garden hose that you can plug into it. Okay, over to the right is respiratory protection. Okay, and you'll notice that it's split into two sub-columns. One says less than or equal to a 4-hour shift, and one says greater than a 4-hour shift. That is telling you, number one, do I need respiratory protection at all? And many of the tasks in Table 1 don't even require respiratory protection. Do I need it at all? And if I do, how much respiratory protection do I need? And there's a thing in there that's called APF, Assigned Protection Factor. The good news is anyone who knows anything about respirators recognizes that phrase, because in the 1910 134 standard that we in the construction industry also use, even though it is a general industry requirement, there is already a chart there that lists all types of professionally manufactured respirators, and they say here are the APF ratings for these types of respirators. Okay, so that's not a new phrase, that's not a new rating or a new chart. Anyone who knows anything about respiratory protection will be able to decipher that. And if you read the back of this presentation on my respiratory slides, it's all in there. Primarily what we're talking about in construction is an APF of 10. So the tasks you see that do require respiratory, all of them except one, and I'll talk about that in a second, says APF 10. So what types of respirators are APF 10? That's a NIOSH N95 filtering face piece. I'm going to show you a picture of this later if we got time. But this is not something that people loosely refer to as a dust mask, right? The white mask, it's actually like a surgical mask. It's designed for nuisance dust. The key there is, does it have one rubber band strap or does it have two? If it's two, by definition, it's a respirator. It's probably a NIOSH N95 respirator. It may have a little filtering face piece right over your mouth, or it's got a thing that goes over the brim of your nose that's metal that you can bend to get a better fit. That's an N95 respirator. By definition, it's a respirator, which requires fit testing and other things. The little one-strap masks, they're not even addressed in the OSHA standard or respiratory protection because by definition, they're not respirators, which means you can't use them to comply with the rule if the task requires it. NIOSH N95 has an APF rating of 10, as does a half-mask elastomeric respirator. Those are the more sturdy plastic ones. They have cartridges that screw off and on. Those also have an APF rating of 10. Now, as you go up the chain, supplied air, the full hoods, the full mask respirators, those go up, right? But there's only one other task on this whole table that has a higher rating than 10, and that's if we're doing mortar grinding or tuck pointing, right? I used to be the safety director for a masonry sub here in town. That's the top of the shelf right there. There's more exposure when you have a grinder in a mortar bed joint doing tuck pointing on a masonry wall. We have any masons in here? That's an APF rating of 25. Okay, so we're talking more about a full face respirator, supplied air, something more than just a NIOSH N95 respirator. But that's it. That's the only one that requires something other than 10. Okay? Now, again, there are 18 of those. There are a few other sidebar requirements. If you elect to go down the road of Table 1 compliance, I said you have to fully comply with the chart. You've got some other stuff here. For example, if you're using a cab or enclosure on the piece of equipment to isolate the person from the dust exposure, that's fine. They talk about the rating of the filter that's in the cab. There's some detail in there. So it's not just the table. There's a few other little sidebar comments that you need to read. And I get a little concerned when I see words that they put in there like, you know, for tasks performed using wet methods, apply water at flow rates sufficient to minimize release of visible dust. It can be visible in just a little bit of dust generated, which we all know, even if you're wet sawing, you're still going to create a very little amount of dust, right? So is that a word they threw in there so they can still beat us up and write a citation? I don't know. I'm not worried about it. I'm going to follow Table 1. I'm going to do what the law gives me the option to do. I'm going to make the best choice for what works for my company and go forward. Okay, but there are some things there. Also, what if you're doing 3 or 4 tasks and all of those tasks are listed on Table 1? Well, if the total duration of those tasks is greater than 4 hours, when you look over to the right on the respiratory column, you follow the greater than 4-hour respiratory protection requirements. Okay, does that make sense? If all your tasks combined in the shift are less than 4 hours, then you follow the less than 4-hour requirements on the respiratory column. That's a pretty busy guy or gal that's doing 2 or 3 of those tasks in one shift, but it's possible depending on the scopes of work you're performing. Here's the other fork in the road. Okay, for whatever reason, if you can't, and I was on the phone last week with a client that does shot blasting. Anybody in here do shot blasting? Shot blasting is not listed on Table 1, which tells me, and this is another question that has not yet been interpreted by OSHA or clearly defined. My interpretation is if the task or equipment is not listed on Table 1, we can't follow Table 1 and come up with imaginary controls that don't exist, right? So they're not going to have any choice but to follow this fork in the road, which is really what we call the alternative exposure control methods. This is where I said earlier, we take the bull by the horns, we bring in the hygienists, we do testing, we figure out which controls are going to work best for us. And they're fine with that. They would rather, I think, you follow Table 1 because they know if you follow Table 1 the way you're supposed to, there's going to be little to no dust generated. At the end of the day, if you can avoid the permissible exposure limit, which you will, if you never have to bring out a person to do sampling if you follow Table 1, but if you're doing shot blasting, you don't have that option. And maybe that will come in a letter of interpretation in the future. Maybe they'll expand on Table 1. As of right now, that's not the case. Okay, so let's talk about this. You bring out your own person and you do testing to determine what exposure levels you're at. Back to the 50, right? That's the permissible exposure limit. If we're above it, we're in violation of the law. If we're above 25, the action level, that means the standard applies and we have to get below that. That's our goal, to get below 25, and then we're good, right? We're in compliance. Performance option, this is the combination of air monitoring data or objective data like we talked about. You hire the hygienist to come out or you use someone else's data from the CSDA example I gave you. Scheduled monitoring option, the employer must perform industrial hygiene monitoring. We're talking each shift, each employee, each job classification, and each work area. That can be a lot, right? Depending on your exposure and what you're doing that triggers the applicability of this standard, that can be a whole lot. So here's the frequency of testing. Initially, you do the test, and then based upon the results, the middle column you see here, that will dictate whether or not you can quit doing the testing or when you have to next do it again, right? So if the employee exposure is at or above the action level but below the PEL, then you have to repeat the testing within 6 months. If the employee exposure is above the PEL, you have to repeat it in 3 months. Employees are below the action level. If we get those results after you initially tested above, then you have to repeat the monitoring within 6 months until 2 consecutive measurements taken 7 or more days apart are below the action level. The employer may then discontinue the monitoring. So you tell me, if you're doing one of those tasks that's listed on Table 1, doesn't that sound a lot easier? Here's the glass half empty side. That's the glass half full approach. If you're doing one of those tasks on Table 1 that requires respiratory protection to be worn, Guess what happens after they've worn it for 30 days? The medical surveillance is triggered. The best scenario you could hope for, I would think, if this standard is going to apply to you, is that you do a task that is listed on Table 1 and doesn't require respiratory protection. Okay? Then it's pretty cut and dried. You avoid the whole medical surveillance. Okay? That's my best interpretation of how it's listed out right now. So that's a lot of sampling, right? If you choose the other path, not the Table 1. So there are a couple ways, most of us realize we're talking about stone, rock, gravel, asphalt, concrete, aggregates. If we're cutting, sawing, grinding, chipping, drilling those, then it's likely we're using those high energy, high impact tools. It's likely we're going to create respirable crystalline silica. Okay, the shot blasting process, I was talking with my client, they use Black Beauty, which has amorphous silica in it, non-hazardous, and less than 1% crystalline silica. So during the shot blasting, even though they're creating this big cloud of dust, a hygienist may in fact tell them that you're perfectly fine, because the dust that you're creating is amorphous silica, not crystalline, quartz, tridymite, tripoli. Okay? So in order to get to this point, we have to first determine what the product is. We do that. You can look at Section 3 on the new GHS format of safety data sheets. Right there it'll tell you the composition. I've highlighted it. This is, I can't remember what this one is for, sand and gravel. So it says, yes, you have crystalline silica and it's greater than 1%. Okay, so that tells you whether or not we have it. But at the end of the day, a hygienist is going to give you some options. You can either take a bulk sample that we put in an envelope and send off to the lab, and they send us a report and tell us what it is. Or they can do, in order to get the exact concentration level, they're going to have to collect air samples from the breathing zone of your workers. And to summarize that, they're going to put this filter on, like you see being worn here, near this person's breathing zone. This is called a cyclone filter assembly, and it's got a little pump on it, and it pumps air. It pumps the air they're breathing through this filter, and there's a media in there. At the end of the day, they take the media out, they put that in a canister, and they send it off to a lab to be analyzed. And then that's when we get the report back that is crystal clear on, no pun intended, on what it contains and at what levels. Recognizing my audience here, I wanted to give you an idea of what the cost of sampling is. Okay, and then I'm going to open this up in just a couple minutes for Q&A. This is not for any specific project. This is me talking to two different industrial hygienists to get some averages. One was in Houston, Texas, and one was in St. Louis. And I got these averages and I put them out. Most people think, wow, it's like paying an attorney, right? $200, $300 an hour. There's a lot more expense to it than just the $250 an hour, which is pretty much the going rate for my assessment. That's 8 hours of them being on site, monitoring these employees that have the cyclone filters on them. So that's $2 grand. Then you have the cost of travel. You have to pay for those pumps. You have to pay for the instrumentation, the filters, the lab analysis, the interpretation, the final report. I'm pretty comfortable in thinking if you were to put pumps on 7 employees, you're going to pay about this amount. $4,200 a day. If the results come back and you're below the action level, great. Take that, and if your processes doesn't change, your equipment doesn't change, you frame that and you hang on to it till death do you part, right? Because they can get you out of a lot of OSHA requirements. If they're not favorable, and you heard me talking the frequency that you have to bring people back to do this testing, every 3 months, every 6 months, until you get 2 consecutive days, 7 apart. At $4,200 a day, that's quite a bit, right? So, like you, probably in the future, like me now, I'm looking for a lot of that objective data that I can give to my clients. Oh, you're only occasionally drilling into concrete, that's cured in an industrial plant. Well, here's the data that the industry has found. You're good, right? It doesn't mean the law's not going to apply to you because you're drilling into concrete, but it may get you out of having to do this test. Okay? Any questions there?